sẽ cố gắng học nhanh nhất có thể, nhanh nhất có thể. 5, 4, 6 trừ 3, 200. Hoặc không. The sugar daddy of science. We are living in a technical age. Many convinced that science and technology hold the answers to all our problems. We should just let the scientists and technicians go on with their work, and they will create heaven here on earth. But science is not an enterprise that takes place on some superior moral or spiritual plane above the rest of human activity. Like all other parts of our culture, it is shaped by economic, political, and religious interests. Science is a very expensive affair. A biologist seeking to understand the human immune system requires laboratories, test tubes, test tubes, chemical and electron microscopes, not to mention lab assistants, technicians, plumbers, and cleaners. An economist seeking to model credit markets must buy computers, set up giant data banks, and develop complicated data processing programs. An archaeologist who wishes to understand the behavior of archaic and hunter-gatherers must travel to distant lands, excavate ancient ruins, and date fossilized bones and artifacts. All of this costs money. During the past 500 years, modern science have achieved wonders thanks largely to the willingness of governments, businesses, foundations, and private donors to channel billions of dollars into scientific research. These billions have done much more to chart the universe, map the planet, and catalog the animal kingdom than did Galileo Galilei, Christopher Columbus, and Charles Darwin. If these particular geniuses have never been born, their insights would probably have occurred to others. But if the proper funding were unavailable, no intellectual brilliance could have compensated for that. If Darwin had never been born, for example, we today attribute the theory of evolution to Alfred Russel Wallace, who came up with the idea of evolution via nature. If the European powers had not financed geographical, geological, and botanical research around the world, neither Darwin nor Wallace would have had the necessary empirical data to develop the theory of evolution. It's likely that they would not even have tried. Why did the billions start flow from government and business coffers into labs and universities? In academic circles, altruist, altru, altruistically give them money to pursue whatever research projects strike their fancy, because somebody believes they can have attained some political, economic, or religious goal. For example, in the 16th century, kings and bankers channeled enormous resources to finance geographical expeditions around the world, but not a penny for studying tribe psychology. This is because kings and bankers surmised that the discovery of new geographical knowledge would enable them to conquer new land and set up trade empires, whereas they couldn't see any profit in understanding child psychology. In the 1940s, the governments of America and the Soviet Union channeled enormous resources to study nuclear physics. Rather than underwater archaeology, they surmised that studying nuclear physics would enable them to develop nuclear weapons. Scientists themselves are not always aware of the political, economic, and religious interests that control the flow of money. Many scientists do, in fact, act out of pure intellectual curiosity. However, only rarely do scientists dictate the scientific agenda. Even if we wanted to finance pure science unaffected by political, economic, or religious interests, it would probably be impossible. Our resources are limited, after all. As a congressman to allocate an additional $1 million to the National Science Foundation for basic research, and he justify and he justify and he just justifiably ask whether that money wouldn't be better used to fund teacher training or to give a needed tax break to a truck factory in his district. To channel limited resources, we must answer questions such as what is more important and what is good. And these are not scientific questions. Science can explain the future. By definition, it has no pretension to knowing what should be in the future. Only two biologists from the same department possessing the same professional skills have both applied for $1 million grant to finance their current research projects. Professor Sluhorn wants to study a disease that infects the udders of cows, causing a 10% decrease in their milk production. Professor Sprout wants to study whether cows suffer mentally when they are separated from their calves. assuming that the amount of money is limited and that it is impossible to finance both research projects. Which ones should be funded? There is no scientific answer to this question. There are only political, economic, and religious answers. In today's world, is it obvious that Slughorn has a better chance of getting the money, not because other diseases are scientifically more interesting than bovine mortality, but because the dairy industry, which stands to benefit from the research, has more political and economic clout than the animal rights lobby. Perhaps in a strict Hindu society where cows are sucked, or in a society committed to animal rights, Professor Sprout would have better shot. But as long as she lives in a society that values the commercial potential of milk and the health of its human citizens over the feelings of cows, she'd better write up her research proposal to as to appeal to those assumptions. For example, she might write that depression leads to a decrease in milk production if we understand the mental world of daisy cows. Of dairy cow, we could develop psychiatric medication that will improve their mood, thus raising milk production by up to 10%. I estimate that there is a global annual market of 250 million for bovine psychiatric medications. Science is unable to set its own priorities. It is also incapable of determining what to do with its discoveries. For example, from a purely scientific viewpoint, it is unclear that we should do with our increasing understanding of genetics. Should we use this knowledge to cure cancer? To create a race of genetically engineered supermen, or to engineer dairy cows with supersized udders? It is obvious that liberal government, a communist government, a Nazi government, and a capitalist business corporation would use the very same over others. In short, scientific research can flourish only in alliance with some religion or ideology. The ideology justifies the cost of the research. In exchange, the ideology influences the scientific agenda and determines what to do with the discoveries. Hence, in order to comprehend how humankind has reached the Alamogordo and the moon, rather than any number of alternative destinations, is not enough to survey the achievement of physicists, biologists, and psychologists. We have to take into account the ideological, political, and economic forces that shape physics, biology, and sociology. Pushing two forces in particular deserve our attention: imperialism and capitalism. The feedback loop between science, empire, and capital has arguably been history's chief engine for the past 500 years. The following chapter analyze its workings. First, we'll look at how the twin turbines of science and empire will latch to one another, and then learn how both were hitched up to the money pump of capitalism. The marriage of early modern astronomers, particularly after Copernicus, argues that the sun, rather than the earth, is located at the center of the universe. A number of astronomers and mathematicians tried to calculate the distance, but their methods provided widely varying results. A reliable means of making the measurements was finally proposed in the middle of the 18th century. Every few years, the planet Venus passes directly between the Sun and the Earth. The duration of the transit differs when seen from distant points on Earth's surface because of the tiny difference in the angle at which the observer sees it. In severe observation of the transits what occurred in 1761 and 1769, so expeditions were sent from Europe to the four possible. In 1761, scientists observed the transit from Siberia, North America, Madagascar, and South Africa. as the scientists were dispatched as far as northern Canada and California, which was then a wilderness. The Royal Society of London for the Improvement of Natural Knowledge concluded that this was not enough to obtain the most accurate result. It was imperative to send an astronomer all the way of the southwestern Pacific Ocean. The Royal Society resolved to send an eminent astronomer, Charles Green, to Tahiti, spared neither effort nor money, but since it was funding such an accompanied by a team of 8 other scientists from several disciplines, headed by botanists Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander. The team also included artists assigned to produce drawings of the new lands, plants, animals, and peoples that the scientists would no doubt encounter. Equipped with the most advanced scientific instruments that Banks and the Royal Society could buy, the expedition was placed under the command of Captain James Cook, an, an experienced seaman as well as an accomplished geographer and ethnologist. Transit from Tahiti in 1769, reconnoitred several Pacific islands, visited Australia, New Zealand, and returned to England in 1771. It brought back enormous quantities of astronomical, geographical, meteorological, botanical, zoological, and anthropological data. Its finding made major contribution to a number of disciplines, sparked the imaginations of Europeans with astonishing tales of the South Pacific, and inspired future generations of naturalists and astronomers. One of the fields that benefited from the Cook expedition was medicine. At the time ships set sail to distant shores knew that more than half their crew's members would die on the journey. The nemesis was not angry natives. Enemy was ships or homesickness. It was a mysterious ailment called scurvy. Men who came down with the disease grew lethargic and depressed, and their gums and other soft tissues bled. As the disease progressed, their teeth fell out, open sores appeared, and they grew feverish, jaundiced, and lost control of their limbs. Between the 16th and 18th century, scurvy is estimated to have claimed the lives of about 2 million sailors. No one knew what caused it, and no matter what remedy was tried, sailors continued to die in droves. A turning point came in 1747 when a British physician, James Lind, conducted a controlled experiment on sailors who suffered from the disease. He separated them into several groups and gave each group a different treatment. One of the test groups were instructed to eat citrus fruits, a common folk remedy for scurvy. The patient in this group promptly recovered. Lind did not know what the citrus fruits had the sailor's body liked, but we now know that it's vitamin C. A typical seaboard diet at that time was notably lacking in foods that are rich in this essential nutrient. On long range voyages, sailors usually subsisted on biscuits and beef jerky and ate almost no fruits or vegetables. The Royal Navy was not convinced by Lind's experiments, but James Cook was. He resolved to prove the doctor right. He loaded his boat with large quantity of sauerkraut and ordered his sailors to eat lots of fresh fruit and vegetables whenever the expedition made landfall. Cook did not lose a single sailor to scurvy. Expedition had another, far less benic, far less benic result. Cook was not only an experienced seaman and geographer but also a naval officer. The Royal Society financed a large part of the expedition's expenses, but the ship itself was provided by the Royal Navy. The Navy also seconded 85 well-armed sailors and mariners and equipped the ship with fishing particular side of the world. Cook claimed for British Australia, native cultures and most of their native population. Australia and New Zealand were taken from their previous inhabitants by European settlers. The native population dropped by up to 80% and the survivors were subjected to a harsh regime of racial oppressions for the Aboriginals. They have never recovered. An even worse fate befell the natives of Tasmania, having survived for 10,000 years in splendid tried within a century of Cook's arrival. European settlers first drove them off the richest parts of the island and then, coveting even the remaining wilderness, hunted them down and killed them systematically. The few survivors were hounded into an evangelical concentration camp were well-meaning but not particularly open-minded missionaries trying to indoctrinate them in the ways of the modern world. The Tasmanians was instructed in reading and writing, but they refused to learn. They became ever more melancholic, stopped having children, lost all interest in life, and finally chose the one escape route from the modern world of science and progress: death. Thấy mặt thì tức. Alas, science and progress pursued them even to the afterlife. The corpses of the last Tasmanians were seized in the name of science by anthropologists and curators. They were dissected, dissected with and measured and analyzed in learners' articles. The skulls and skeletons were then put on display in museum and and anthro- and anthropological collections. Only in 1876 did the Tasmanian Museum give up for burial the skeleton of Chuganini. Royal College of Surgeons held on to samples of her skin and hair until 2002. Was Cook's ship a scientific expedition protected by a military force or a military expedition with a few scientists tagging along? That's like asking whether your petrol tanks are half empty or half full. It was both. The scientific revolution and modern imperialism were inseparable. People such as Captain James Cook and the botanist Joseph Banks could hardly distinguish science from empire, nor could Luckless Chuganini. Why Europe? The fact that people from large island in the northern Atlantic conquered a large island south of Australia is one of history's more bizarre occurrences. Not long before Cook's expedition, the British Azores and Western Europeans in general were but distant backwaters of the Mediterranean world. Little of importance ever happened there. Even the Roman Empire, the only important pre-modern European empire, derived most of its wealth from its North America, Balkan, and Middle Eastern provinces. Rome's Western European provinces were a poor Wild West, which contributed little aside from mineral and slaves. Northern Europe was so desolate and barbarous that it wasn't even worth conquering. Chuganini, the last native Tasmanian. Salamanca Cataract Gorge Reserve. Get there. 29 million. That's life. Only at the end of the 15th century did 1500 and 1750 Western Europe gained momentum and became master of the outer world, meaning the two American continents and the oceans. Yet even the Europe was no match for the great powers of Asia. European managed to conquer America and gain supremacy at seas mainly because the Asiatic powers showed little interest in the Chinese Ming and Qing dynasties. They expanded their territory significantly and enjoyed unprecedented demographic and economic growth. In 1775, Asia accounted for 80% of the world economy. The combined economies of India and China alone represent European humiliated the Asian powers in a series of wars and conquered large parts of Asia of its territory. In 1950, Western European and the United States together accounted for more than half of global production, whereas China's portion has been reduced to 5%. To a much greater extent than they usually want to admit, European interest, thought, and taste. They may be fiercely anti-European in their almost everyone on the planet views politics, medicine, war, and economics through Europeans' eye, and listen to music written in European modes with words in European language. Even today's burgeoning Chinese economy, which may soon regain its global primacy, is built on a European model of production and finance. How did the people of this richest finger of Eurasia managed to break out. It's unquestionable that from 1850 onward, European domination rested to a large extent on the military, industrial, scientific complex, and technological wizardry. All successful late modern empires cultivated scientific research in the hope of harvesting technological innovation, and many scientists spend most of their time working on arms, medicines, and machine guns, and they don't. Civilian technologies were no less important. Canned food fed soldiers, railroads and steamships transported soldiers and their provisions, while a new arsenal of medicines cured while a new arsenal of medicine cured soldiers, sailors, and locomotive engineers. These logistical advances played a more significant role in the European conquest of Africa than did the machine gun. But that wasn't the case before 1850. The military industrial scientific complex was still in its infancy. The technology fruits of scientific revolution was unripe, and the technological gap certainly had far better technological than the Australia Aborigines, but not by Captain Wanjangsi or Captain Hussein Pasha. More importantly, if in 1770 Europeans had no significant technological advantage over Muslims, Indians, and Chinese, how did they manage in the following century to open such a gap between themselves and the rest of the world? Who knows? Why did the military industrial scientific complex blossom in Europe behind when the gap between industrial and non-industrial nations became an obvious economic and political factor? Why did Russia, Italy, and Australia succeed in closing it, whereas Persia, Egypt, and the Ottoman Empire failed? After all, the technology of the first industrial wave was relatively simple. Was it so hard for Chinese or Ottoman to engineer steam engines, manufacture machine guns, and lay down railroads? The world's first commercial railroad opened for businesses in of railroads, but in the whole Asia, Africa, and Latin America, there were only 4,000 kilometers of tracks. In 1880, the West boasted more than 350,000 35,000 kilometers of train lines, and most of these were laid by the British in India. The first railroad in China opened only in 1876. It was 25 kilometers long and built by Europeans. The Chinese government destroyed it the following year. In 1880, the Chinese Empire did not operate a single railroad. The first railroad in Persia was built only in 1888, and it connected Tehran with a Muslim holy site about 10 kilometers south of the capital. It was constructed and operated by a Belgian company in 1950. The total railway network of Persia still amounted to a meager of 2,500 kilometers in this country, 7 times the size of Britain. The Chinese and Persians did not lack technological inventions such as steam engines, which could be freely copied or bought. They lacked a value myths, judicial apparatus, and socio-political structures that took centuries to form and mature in West and in which could not be copied and internalized rapidly. France and the Union, the Chinese and Persians could not catch up as quickly because they thought that organized their society differently. This explanation shed new light on the period from 8,500 to 1850. During this era, Europe did not enjoy any obvious technological, political, military, and or economic advantage over the Asian power. Yet the obvious around 1850, the the apparent equality between Europe, China, and Muslim were in 1750 was a mirage. Imagine two builders, each busy constructing very tall tower. One builder used wood and mud bricks, whereas the other used steel and concrete. At first, it seems that there's not much of a difference between the two methods, since both towers grow at a similar pace and reach a similar height. However, once a critical threshold is crossed, the wood and mud tower cannot stand the strain and collapse, whereas the steel and concrete tower grow story by story as far as the eye can see. What potential did Europe develop in early modern period that enabled it to dominate the late modern world? There are two complementary answers to this question: modern science and capitalism. European was used to thinking and behaving in a scientific and capitalist way even before they enjoyed any significant technological advantage. When the technological bonanza began, Europeans could harness it far better than anybody else. So it is hardly coincidental that science and capitalism form the most important legacy that European imperialism has bequeathed the post-European world of the 21st century. Europe and Europeans no longer rule the world, but science and capital are growing ever stronger. The victory of capitalism are examined in the following chapter. This chapter is dedicated to the love story between European imperialism and modern science. The mentality is the discipline obviously owns a huge debt to ancient scientific traditions, such as those of classical Greece, China, India, and Iceland. Yet its unique character began to take shape only the Netherlands. During the earlier modern period, Chinese, Indian, Muslims, Native Americans, and Polynesians continued to make important contributions to the scientific revolution. The insights of Muslim economists were studied by Adam Smith, and Karl Marx's treatments, pioneered by Native American doctors, found their way to ecology. But until the mid-20th century, the Europeans who collated these myriad scientific discoveries, creating scientific disciplines in the process, were the ruling and intellectual Islamic world produced minds as intelligent and curious as those of Europe. However, between 1500 and 1950, they did not produce anything that comes even close to the end of science. An Arab monopoly, but was subsequently taken over by Turks and Persians. So modern science began as European specific specialty, but is today becoming a multi-ethnic enterprise. What forged the history of bond between modern science and European technology was an important factor in the 19th and 20th century. The key factor was that the plant-seeking botanists and the colony-seeking naval officers shared a similar mindset. Both scientists and conquerors began by admitting ignorance. They both say, "I don't know what's out there." They both felt compelled to go out and make new discoveries, and they both hoped that the new knowledge thus acquired would make them master of the world. European imperialism were entirely unlike all other imperial projects in history. Previous seekers of empire tended to assume that they bình thường em cũng đưa cho chị cả củ cả dây, chắc hôm nay em uống bia vào đấy. Tí nữa em giúp cho chị nhé. Vâng, nếu em nhớ ra, chắc là em vẫn nhớ ra thôi. Nhớ đi. Đầu thấy hơi hoa mắt rồi á.
Giờ mới ngấm hả? Giờ thì chị tỉnh thì mới ngấm hả?
Em đọc lên. Đúng, chị ngồi viết thứ mà chị không phải mỏi tay nhất nhưng mà lại là mỏi mắt nhất.
Hơn 10 lét chị hiểu. Nhìn mà đã muốn ngủ rồi.
Không, khả năng là mình là kiểu đầu óc ngu si tứ chi phát triển nên là không, em bảo em.
Mày mắng là chị luôn.
Em bảo em, ý là đầu óc ngu si tứ chi phát triển nên là cứ cái gì liên quan đến đầu óc là cái mắt mình là ở trên đầu mà, thì đầu óc mình nó sẽ không process tốt bằng việc là bằng tay hay bằng mồm. Không, em đang nói em mà. Em đang nói em đấy.
Nhưng mà em mua gừng đây còn không?
Còn đầy ạ.
Em để đâu rồi?
Chị uống trà gừng hay sao? Hay đưa cho chị một củ để chị cầm?
Mày gáo mà đưa chị cầm việc gì em? Ôm đi ngủ à? Áo người chị đã tỉnh rồi chứ ạ.
Bây giờ chị có làm cốc trà gừng không?
Em không muốn uống không?
Giờ em chỉ uống nước lọc thôi.
Chị hỏi đi thôi, được không?
Em để ở dưới cái bình nước nhá. Vâng, ở trong cái túi lưới. Vâng, ok em. Dạ. Bây giờ là 10 giờ 15 phút. Vâng. Vâng. Em chỉ còn 200 trang nữa thôi. Em nản quá. Thế sao cả năm mình đều chơi, bây giờ mới đọc. Thật đấy, bây giờ em đang đọc giáp chứ đọc chữ gì nữa. Em đọc 10 rưỡi, đằng nào cũng trôi hết lại. Ok, bắt đầu. European imperialism was entirely unlike all other imperial projects in history. Previous seekers of empire tended to assume that they already understood the world, conquest merely utilize and spread their view of the world. The Arabs, to name one, assembled and conquered Egypt, Spain, or India in order to discover something they did not know. Voraciously conquered new lands in search of powers and wealth, not of knowledge. In contrast, European imperialists set out to distant shores in the hope of obtaining new knowledge, along with new territories. James Cooks were not the first explorer to think this way. The Portuguese and Spanish voyagers of the 15th and 16th century already did. Prince Henry and Navigator and Vasco da Gama explored the coast of Africa, and while Jinzhou seized control of islands and harbors, Christopher Columbus discovered America and immediately claimed sovereignty over the new lands for the kings of Spain. Ferdinand Magellan found a way around the world and simultaneously laid the foundation of Spanish conquest of the Philippines. As time went by, the conquest of the knowledge and the conquest of territory became ever more tightly intertwined. In the 18th and 19th century, almost every important military expedition that left Europe for distant lands had on board scientists who set out not to fly but to make scientific discovery. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, he took 865 scholars with him. Among other things, they found that entirely new discipline Egyptology and made important contributions to the study of religion, linguistics, and botany. In the Falkland Islands and the Gala needed this knowledge in order to be better prepared in the event of war. The ship's captain, who was an amazing scientist, decided to add a geologist to the expedition to study geological formation. 22-year-old Cambridge graduate Charlie Darwin. Darwin has studied to become an Anglican passion, but was far more interested in geology and natural science than in the Bible. He jumped at the opportunity, and the rest is history. The captain spent his time on the voyage drawing military maps while Darwin collected the empirical data and formulated the insights that would eventually become the theory of evolution. On 20th of July 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the surface of the moon. In the months leading up to their expedition, the Apollo 11 astronauts trained in the remote moon-like desert in the western United States. The area is home to several Native American communities, and there is a story or legend describing an encounter between the astronauts and the man asked them what they were doing there. He replied that they were part of a research expedition that would shortly travel to explore the moon. When the old man heard that, he fell silent for a few moments and then asked the astronaut if they could do him a favor. "What do you want there?" "Well," said the woman, "the people of my tribe believe that Holy Spirits live on the moon. I want." The man uttered something in his tribal language and then asked the astronauts to repeat it again and again until they had spirits. "I would love to know." When they returned to their base, the astronauts searched and searched until they found someone who could speak the tribal language and asked him to translate the secret message. When they repeated what they had memorized, the translator started to laugh uproariously. When he calmed down, the astronauts asked him what it meant. The man explained that sentence they had memorized so carefully said, "Don't believe a single word these empty maps." The modern explore and conquer mentality is nicely illustrated by the development of world maps. Many cultures drew world maps long before the modern age. Obviously, none of them really knew the whole of the world. No Afro-Asian culture knew about American, and no American culture knew about Afro-Asia, but unfamiliar areas were simply left out or filled with imaginary monsters and wonders. These maps has no empty spaces. It gave the impressions of a familiarity with the entire world. During the 15th and 16th century, Europeans began to draw world maps with the empty maps were psychological and ideological breakthrough, a clear admission that Europeans were ignorant of large part of the world. The crucial turning point came in 1492 when Christopher Columbus sailed westward from Spain, seeking a new route to East Asia. Columbus, still believing the old complete world maps using them, Columbus calculated that Japan should have been located about 70 kilometers, and entire unknown continent separate East Asia from Spain. On 12 October 1492, at about 2 a.m., Columbus' expedition collided with the unknown continent. John Roget Burmese, watching from the mast of the ship Pinta, spotted an island in what we now call the Bahamas and shouted, "Land, land!" Columbus believed he had reached a small island of the East Asian coast. He called the people found there Indians because he thought he had landed in the Indies, what we now call the East Indies of the Indonesian archipelago. Columbus stuck to this era for the rest of his life. The idea that he had discovered a completely unknown continent was inconceivable for him and for many his generation. For thousands of years, not only the greatest thinkers and scholars, but also the infallible scriptures had known only Europe, Africa, and Asia. Could they all have been wrong? Could the Bible have missed or half? Could the Bible have missed half the world? It would be as if in 1969, on its way to the moon, Apollo 11 had crashed into a hitherto unknown moon circling the Earth, which all previous observations had somehow failed to spot. In his refusal to admit ignorance, Columbus was still a mediocre man. He was convinced he knew the whole world, and even his momentous discovery failed to convince him otherwise. A European world map from 1459. Europe is in top left corner. The map is filled with the first modern man to Europeans such as South Africa. The first modern man was Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian sailor who took part in several expeditions to America in the years 1499 to 1504. Between 1502 and 1504, two texts describing these expeditions were published in Europe. They were attributed to Vespucci. These texts argue that the new lands discovered by Columbus were not islands off the Asian coast, but rather an entire continent unknown to the scripture, classical geographer, and contemporary Europeans. World map. The first to show the place where Europe's westward sailing fleets had landed as a separate continent, having drawn it. One similar had to give it a name. Erroneously believed that America was similar named the continent in his honor, America. The one similar map became very popular and was copied by many other cartographers, spreading the name he had given the new land. There is poetic justice in the fact that a quarter of the world and two of its 7 continents are named after a little-known Italian, whose sole claim to fame is that he had the courage to say, "We don't know." The discovery of America was the foundational event of the scientific revolution. It's not only taught to the European to favor present observation over past traditions, but the desire to conquer America also obliged Europeans to search for new knowledge at breakneck of new data about the geography, climate, flora, fauna, languages, cultures, and history of the new continent. Not only European geographers, but European scholars in almost all other fields of knowledge began to draw maps with spaces left to fill in. They began to admit that their theories were not perfect and that there were important things that they did not know. The Europeans were drawn to the blind spots on the map as if they were magnets and promptly started filling them in. During the 15th and 16th century, European expeditions circumnavigated Africa, explored America, across the Pacific and Indian Oceans and created a network of bases and colonies all over the world. They established the first truly global empire and knitted together the first global trade network. The European imperial expedition transformed the history of the world from being a series of history of isolated peoples and cultures. It became the history of a single integrated human society. The Soviet world map 1525, while the 1459 world map is full of continents, islands, and detailed explanation. The Soviet map is mostly empty. The eye wanders south along the American coastline until it peters into emptiness. On this point, the map gives no. These European explore and conquer expeditions are so familiar to us that we tend to overlook just how extraordinary they were. Nothing like them had ever happened before. Long distance campaigns of conquest are not a natural undertaking. Throughout history, most human society was so busy with local conflicts and neighborhood quarrels that they never considered exploring and conquering distant lands. Most great empires extended their control only over their immediate neighborhood. They reached far-flung lands simply because their neighborhood kept expanding. Thus, the Romans conquered Etruria in order to defend Rome c. 350 to 300 BC. They then conquered the Po Valley in order to defend Etruria c. 200 BC. They subsequently conquered Provence to defend the Po Valley c. 820 BC, go to defend Provence c. 50 BC, and Britain in order to defend Gaul c. 850. It took them 400 years to get from Rome to London. In 350 BC, no Roman would have conceived of sailing directly to Britain and conquering it. Occasionally, an ambitious ruler of adventure would embark on a long-range campaign of conquest, but such campaign usually followed well-beaten imperial commercial paths. The campaigns of Alexander the Great, for example, did not result in the establishment of a new empire, but rather in the usurpation of an existing empire, that of the Persians. The closest precedents to the modern European empires were the ancient Navan empires of Athens and Carthage, and the medieval naval empire of Majapahit, which held sway over much of Indonesia in the 14th century. Yet even these empires rarely go undertakings when compared to the global ventures of the modern Europeans. Many scholars argue that the voyages of Admiral Zheng He of the Chinese Ming Dynasty heralded and eclipsed the European voyages of discovery between 1405 and 1432. Zheng led 7 huge armadas from China to the far reaches of the Indian Ocean. The largest of these comprised almost 300 ships and carried close to 30,000 people. They visited Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and East Africa. Chinese ships anchored in Jeddah, the main harbor of the Hejaz in Malaysia on the Kenyan coast. Columbus' fleet on 1492, which consisted of 3 small ships manned by 120 sailors, was like a tribe of mosquitoes compared to Zhang He's drove of dragons. Oh my god. Yet there was a crucial difference. Zhang He explored the ocean and assisted pro-Chinese rulers, but he did not try to conquer or colonize the countries he's visited. Moreover, the expeditions of Zheng He was not deeply rooted in Chinese politics and culture. When the ruling faction in Beijing changed during the 1430s, dismantled, geographical knowledge was lost, and no explorer such as stature and means even set out most Chinese and ambitions to the Middle Kingdom's immediate environs or environ, I don't know. What made European exceptional was their unparalleled and insatiable ambition to explore and conquer. Although they might have had the ability, the Romans never attempted to conquer India and Scandinavia. The conquer engineer. There was nothing peculiar about that. The oddity is that early modern Europeans caught a fever that drove them to sail to distant and completely unknown lands full of alien cultures, take one step onto their beaches, and immediately declare, I claim all these territories for my king. Zheng He's flagship next to that of Columbus. Oh my god, con thuyền của cái ông Zheng He này so với con muỗi Colombo này kinh khủng nhỉ. Invasion from outer space around 1570. Ôi mỏi mồm quá, hôm nay đến đây rồi, tôi mệt rồi, mình dừng lại thôi. The scientific revolution, the capitalist greed, the wheels of industry, a permanent revolution, and they live happily ever after. The end of Homo sapiens. Afterward, the animal that became a god. Note, acknowledgement, image credit. Nó là cả một hành trình dài từ đây cho đến đây là gần hết rồi á. Nhưng mà tập này thì